Why don't we go to the next slide, Jim? We'll go through a couple quickly. Again, just welcome from George Mason University, and the next slide is from the college that I had the great privilege to lead for 10 years, our College of Education and Human Development at George Mason, having moved into the role of provost over the last few months, which has been a great honor and a privilege for me. So let us begin going to the next two more slides down. Oh, that one's good to stop at, Jim. Oh, one back, I'm sorry. Nelson, let me begin just with a couple of general comments. That first, Nelson Mandela, of course, the famous diplomat from South Africa, former president of South Africa, involved in the United Nations, has said that education is the most powerful weapon used to change the world. And I think we all would agree with that. On the next slide is a very brief quote from our former president, Barack Obama, who said that education is no longer just a pathway to opportunity and success, it's a prerequisite to success. And I think both Mandela and Obama were correct. Next slide. In Virginia, we often say, in the state that we live in and work in, that Virginia is for learners. For some of you who know the play on this, Virginia's state slogan for many years has been Virginia is for lovers. But we've played on that a little bit as educators and have kept the heart, but know that it's in our heart that learning is what is really at the base and will be the most, and is the most important value we have in our community, that Virginia is for learners. Next slide. And these are just a small group of the learners that we work with in the public schools of our state on a daily basis. Next slide. So let me give you just a thumbnail about education in the United States, some of the facts and figures that give us a little bit of a picture and rounds out education generally in the US. At the moment, this is data from last year, there are about 76 million students, 76 million students enrolled in schools in the United States at the P12 level, P meaning preschool, 12 meaning the 12th grade. So this is from about age 4 to age 18. There were about 51 million roughly students in the public P12 schools of the United States, almost another 6 million in private schools. And you can see the listing of the various ages and grade levels of these students. The demographics of the students in the country today in the United States is that the majority are non-Caucasian, the majority are students of color or of non-Caucasian origin, which is a change over the last few years in the United States and has been truly a game-changing. In terms of students, there are almost 76 million students in the country. I'll show you where the other 25 million or so come from in a moment. There are about 3.7 million teachers in the United States instructing those students on a daily basis. Next slide. There are about 131,000 schools in the United States as of 2018, to give you some kind of baseline about, you can see the breakdown between elementary and public and private schools, secondary meaning grade 7 through grade 12, generally from the age of 12 or 13 to 18, and combined schools that are P12, that is where we have students from about age 4 or 5 up until age 18 in one general large facility. You can see there are almost 16,000 of those. So this just gives you a size of the system in the country. If you can go back, that's a good slide to start with. Next slide, Jim. In terms of school districts in the United States, that is the configurations, the organizational structure of schools, there are about 13,500, 13,598 to be specific, districts or organizational entities that sponsor schools in the United States across the entire country. We have 133 such schools. We call them divisions. Oftentimes in states around the United States, they're called districts around the United States, about 133 of which are in Virginia. Virginia school districts tend to be large. They tend to be based upon county rather than small communities. In many states around the country, they're based more on small communities and counties. And so our school systems tend to be relatively large. Next slide shows us the average population of students in a school in the United States is a little over 500. So schools generally are around 500. We have schools that are in the 3,000 to 4,000 range. We have schools that are in the 100 to 200 range, but the arithmetic mean is 528. Next slide. In Northern Virginia, to give you an idea of the size of the school organizational entities, the school divisions or school districts in the areas surrounding our university, we reside in a county called Fairfax. Fairfax County Schools is the 10th largest school system in the United States with close to 190,000 students and 222 schools. Two of the other counties in which are close to where we live and work, you can see are also quite large in size. And so the schools that we tend to work with as a university, the schools that our children attend, tend to be large, relatively sophisticated, and quite well-respected school systems. These three school systems are generally thought of as in the top 10% of all the schools in the United States in terms of the quality of the instruction, in terms of the performance of their students on standardized examinations, in terms of almost any metric that you can think of with respect to how we assess school performance and school capacity. Next slide. I also want to speak a little bit about early childhood education, which is where education begins, beginning at birth. Some would argue, and I would as well, that what we do prenatally with women who are pregnant is also important. But providing care and education to our youngest citizens, beginning soon after birth, continuing until they enter the formal school system is also important. Next slide shows us that there are about 856,000 child care programs, early education programs in the United States. These range greatly in terms of their structure, from individuals taking care of children in their homes to center-based, well-organized programs that care for 50, 60, 100, 150, or 200 children. So the range is very broad, as is the quality of early care and education, early childhood education in the United States. And it's the part of our educational system in America that's the least regulated and the least consistent in terms of the way in which services are provided, the quality and capacity of those services, and also the experiences of young children. There are about 1.6 million young children, by the way, enrolled in these facilities and in these programs and in these services throughout the United States in the last year. Next slide shows us a little bit about universities in the United States. And you can see that there are only last fall, close to 20 million students enrolled in American universities. And you can see some of the demographic breakdown about that. This fall, I'm sure the case in Pakistan, as it is in the United States, will be a fall unlike any others for schools generally. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But clearly, this is a time of great need to adapt, a great need to adjust, and it's resulted in many changes in our educational systems, in our pedagogic processes, and in the ways in which we're both educating and teaching our children throughout the United States. One of the challenges we face, next slide, is as the great American educational reformer of the last century, Horace Mann, told us that education is the great equalizer. We are a very diverse society, as you know, in the United States. People from every walk of life, from almost every part of the planet, from every racial and ethnic group, speaking many different languages. And one of the things that we think is important, not only as Obama said that education is primary to our vitality as a nation, but it's also important to our equalizing the disequity that historically has existed in the United States and still exists both here and around the world. By the way, the biggest disequity when it comes to the quality of education and educational outcomes, statistically, with all the research that I and many others have done through the years, the greatest driver of that disequity is economic disequity, poverty in particular. Next slide is just a brief picture of a couple of kids. And I wanted to put this in because they're metaphorically showing they have the whole world in their hands. Maybe you know that song, you have the whole world in your hands. It's a great children's song that we sing with children. And I think this is absolutely the case, that the young children, the world belongs to the young, and the young will be the leaders of tomorrow. And so we have a special responsibility to educate both the young and the old, from people from every walk of life, from every part of the planet, with every language, with every racial ethnic group, et cetera, et cetera. And as the next slide tells us, as Socrates so many centuries ago said, that wisdom begins in wonder. And in education, we talk a lot about giving children wisdom, but we also know that children need to wonder. They need to wonder about their world. They need to wonder about what life is like. They need to wonder about the very essence of who they are in order to develop that wisdom. Here's the next slide, a group of young children who are wondering. They're wondering about something that was told to them. You can see the inquisitiveness on their face. And that's what good education is about, is helping children to wonder so that they develop wisdom. Next slide. And in schools today, we tend to focus on two general domains, on learning on the one hand and development on the other. And I like to think about them being two sides of a coin. We teach kids so they learn, but they learn so that they can develop. Human development, becoming better people, becoming adults, traversing childhood and becoming a productive citizen. And we think of three general domains of development: cognitive or intellectual development, social and emotional development, and physical development. And in schools today, it's my belief that we have to be multidimensional, multifactorial, if you will, in our educational programs that focus on each of these spheres. And that we also look to provide a greater sense of stability economically in particular, for families and communities, so that we can better level that playing field. So what are the building blocks of school success? What are the building blocks of success for students? These are some of them. People, that is providing a highly trained, highly capable, highly committed teacher in every classroom. The single most important ingredient to assure the success of education is the ability, the capacity, and the commitment of our teachers. But we also need great programs, and we need great facilities. The elements of success not only are teachers, they're school leaders. Every organization is a good organization. Every organization that becomes a great organization is great because they have great workers and they have great leaders. In the case of schools, that's teachers and principals and other administrators who lead programs. That will create a culture for schools that's an enlivening and enriching culture. We have curriculum and supplies and facilities. We engage families and parents in the educational process. We engage the entire community in education and support the community to support their students, their children. And that there be government level political policies, political level support for programs, for financial obligations to support schools so that they can provide the very best programs possible. The next slide provides just a small little systemic understanding of what some of the dimensions of this highly engaged, highly important, highly opportunistic, and highly consequential field of education we talk about. This slide is instructed and intended to show you that it really is a system, and that the system is only as powerful and as strong as its weakest link, like a chain. And all of these pieces need to be strong in order for schools to be effective. Next slide. And that schools become learning communities. That they are a learning community for students, but also a learning community for faculty, staff, and administrators. And that we think about in the next slide how it is and what it is that we want our students to be when they conclude. What's the portrait of a graduate? How do we perceive and what do we believe students should achieve when they become graduates? And the next slide tells us that research is now clearly suggesting that there are 21st century skills that we believe ought to be part of this portrait of what a graduate looks like when they conclude and as they engage, as they traverse and go through the educational process. We call them the 5 C's and 1 P: critical thinking, creative thinking, collaboration, communication, citizenship, and the ability to solve problems because of the 5 C's in front. These are the 21st century skills. This is what we instill in our students. This is what today in the United States and increasingly around the world, we think the graduates of our educational systems ought to be able to have as a set of skills embedded within these principles that will help them to become successful. Next slide. And part of it is getting schools ready. We oftentimes think about how it is we get kids ready for schools, but the next slide tells us that I firmly believe that there's a distinction between getting kids ready for school, in which we typically have talked about when we speak about the concept of school readiness, getting kids ready for schools, versus getting schools ready for kids. I think it's more important. I think as educators and as those who develop and think about the policies that make schools to be effective, that the most important thing we can do to get children ready for school, to get children ready for life, is to be sure that their schools are ready to meet their needs. Next slide shows us a group of children who are in school. And the next slide tells us that we need to prepare ourselves to understand that children have different learning styles and kids have different needs. That's part of getting schools ready for kids, is to understand that kids are different. The next slide shows us a child with different abilities. It's important that we provide educational experiences for every child, irrespective of their ability. The next slide tells us that we need to be attentive to diversity and inclusion, that we think about things like cultural competence, things like linguistic diversity. We have many of our schools in our area, a high school just down the road from George Mason University. Over 50 languages are spoken in that school. There's linguistic diversity. There's economic diversity, kids coming from every walk of life, from every family situation, and certainly kids with special needs. When we speak of teachers, William Arthur Ward tells us that the mediocre teacher tells, the good teacher explains, and the superior teacher demonstrates. But Ward tells us that the great teacher inspires. And that's really what education is about, is inspiring students to be active, as the next slide tells us, engaged in learning, to be problem and project-based in our pedagogies, and to be inquiry-based in our models of teaching. That is to help kids to explore, because wisdom begins in wonder. Teachers need to know content, for certainly, as the next slide tells us. They need to know content, but they also have to be able to implore. Next slide says that we need to know. Knowing versus doing is a lot like learning versus performance. Teachers need to know, but they need to do, and we need to help kids to learn so that they can perform. Benjamin Franklin, a great American leader in the early part of our nation's history, was quoted as saying, "Tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, involve me and I may learn." That's really what we try to do in education today. Is we don't just tell kids, we don't just inform them so they can regurgitate and tell us on an exam specifically what we said. We want them to be involved. We want them to be able to apply and adapt their learning. So let me show you a little bit about how we do that in some photographs. This is education then and now. If we go to the next couple of slides, we'll run through these quickly. Classrooms of 20 years ago looked like this. This is the way they looked, but this is the way they look now. Let's go through these slides very quickly, Jim. They're engaged. You see children engaged and learning, bright colored classrooms, doing experiments with teachers. We just go through these quickly. Reading with each other, music, art, really engaged. If we go through these slides quickly, it gives you a sense of this is the classroom today in America. Classrooms that are involved, where kids are learning because they're engaging. And this is what we ask our teachers to learn to do, not just to tell, but to be able to engage. So let me pivot for a moment in the last couple of minutes I have and talk a little bit about COVID-19 and coronavirus and its impact. We worked very hard in the United States to think, as the next slide says, about how it is that we can safely return students to school. I think you follow the news, we follow the news, that we have a tragic situation in the United States where COVID-19 has consumed every one of our communities across the country. We have terrific outbreaks, millions of people who've been infected, close to 200,000 who have perished through the virus, and much controversy about whether or not we can open schools. There are many, many challenges in doing so. And we have a great deal of difference of views about whether or not we can reopen schools this fall. Many universities have pivoted to become a virtual or online space entirely. At our university, we have had, and we are beginning next week, a combination of a very small number of on-campus classes with a very large number of virtual or remote learning classes. We have some students coming back to classes on campus. We have many students who are going to be taking their classes virtually. We hope to be able to have more and more students come back to us as we begin to get a better handle on the virus. There are many, many challenges, few solutions. This slide tells you a little bit about what some of those challenges are. And we know as we've moved to virtual learning in the P12 space, that is for children aged 4 to 18, that there are great variabilities in families' opportunities to connect to the internet, to have equipment and broadband access, wireless access in particular of broadband nature, and to be able to appropriately access virtual learning, and to be able, as parents and families, to support our children. Classrooms today will look more like the next slide than they did slides earlier on, with children and teachers wearing masks, protecting each other, and probably not being nearly as close to each other as in this picture. But I wanted to identify and just have a graphic showing children wearing masks, which is so important to helping to prevent and mitigate the spread of the virus. The next slide, it tells us the risk factors with schools. The lowest risk for our students and for ourselves is virtual learning. There's more risk when there's smaller in-person environments, and certainly the highest risk when we have fully configured classrooms, which some schools are attempting to do in the United States. I need to tell you that, although I am a big proponent to not do that. I think we need to be very careful to physically distance, to create socially isolated environments as possible, and to take all the mitigated efforts as possible to make things as healthy as possible. The next slide, Stephen Covey, the organizational theorist, tells us that at times it's both doing things right and doing the right thing. We need to be sure, as we think about the reopening of schools, as we think about the education of our children, whether we do that virtually or whether we're doing that on campus, on site, that we do it right, but we also do the right thing by protecting their health and safety. And the next slide tells us that in every crisis, there is both danger and opportunity, as our colleagues in China have long ago taught us. In every crisis, there is both danger, and opportunity. Right now, an article I recently read said that we've gone through and are in the midst of 3 phases with respect to adapting and adjusting to COVID-19. The first phase was disruption. We have disrupted, we have become disrupted, we have interrupted, things have changed. A guy named Derek Thompson, who's the editor of the Atlantic magazine, a very well-known periodical in the United States, recently wrote that the first phase of COVID-19 brought disruption. The second phase brought invention. We became inventive, thought about new ways of doing things. And we certainly in education have thought about new ways of doing things. And the third phase that we're entering now is a phase of acceleration. How we can manage the disruption in ways that the danger becomes opportunity through our inventions, and accelerate the very best of what we've learned to adapt and adjust to become more adaptive as we continue to adjust to the real tragedies of this virus. And so that's kind of a brief snapshot. I wanted to give you a little bit of a snapshot, a grounding in education today in the United States, some of the key and critical issues that we're focused on in a very brief period of time. It's hard to do a whole coursework of conversation in 20 minutes, but I hope this provided a little bit of a baseline and a catalyst for conversation. Thank you very much for asking me to participate, Jim. Thank you. And thanks to our colleagues in Pakistan. Great to be with you this morning.